Welcome back, everyone. We're in part 4 of our gospel-grounded ministry to sexual minorities, subsection 2. So here we're continuing on. Our part 3 was really a lot of hands-on stuff, what individuals themselves can do that might be helpful. Obviously, there's going to be some of it in this section too, but this is more to friends, family, church leaders. These are things you can do and to help sexual minorities that you may be close to. But as in section 4.1, there's some preliminary stuff you need to understand and get clear on. 4.1, we talked about kind of the stuff going on inside of you that you need to be aware of and maybe come to terms with. And in this section, we need you to be aware of some of the larger societal dynamics that the sexual minorities you're ministering to, and probably yourself can easily get sucked into. So why it's important is right here in this last sentence that you see. If you're not aware of some of these dynamics, you might end up, for the best motives in the world, but still doing harm, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. That's probably more true here than just about anywhere else. Your good intentions can lead you and some people astray if you aren't aware of what's going on. So let's talk about, you'll notice we did not call this section for how to be an ally or being a better ally. Why don't we use the term ally? You want to jump in here, Dan, with this?
Sure. We did mention in a previous presentation that the notion of an ally almost requires an enemy, right? And so that's one of the reasons.
Yeah, if you're the ally, who are the other people?
Right. Correct.
The non-allies, i.e. enemies.
Correct. And so, and another reason why is the ally movement has become something, it's almost a movement with sort of a bunch of presets that you sort of fall into. And what we're trying to do here is examine those in an honest way. So when we're talking about the ally movement, we're talking about individuals and groups who are seeking to support people who are living the sexual minority experience. And allies in general.
And from that standpoint, that's great so far.
Yes. And so allies vary in their understanding of the issues, their critical thinking skills, their depth of conversion to the gospel, their emotional intelligence, and their willingness to forego their own discomfort and need to be seen as the rescuer. Now, think of your typical ally. It might be a member of the church who really has never thought through the church's teachings on gender and sexuality, has always just kind of taken them for granted. And then maybe, that person, one of their siblings or sons or daughters, comes out as a sexual minority and they're caught off guard. They have not thought this through. And all of a sudden they really feel like there's this massive chasm between what this loved one needs and what they are capable of doing. And a lot of people will immediately rush out looking for resources. Oh, how do I be an ally? How do I help this loved one of mine who is scared or worried or, feeling uncertain about the future? How do I help? And this individual who is now saying, how do I become an ally? Again, they might not have very good critical thinking skills. So they might take in a whole lot of materials and narratives and social media posts and things like that promote ideas that are really counterproductive.
And for themselves and maybe their friends. So they'll rush. And the problem is, in their defense, there's a lot of really crummy information out there.
Yeah.
This does kind of remind me about your work in faith crisis ministry.
Yeah.
Because, we can have a certain I hate the word naive, but there's certain ways of thinking and certain assumptions we bring in, and then we find the CES letter, we learn more about the book of Abraham or whatever it is, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, what do I do?
Right.
And in order to pass through that phase successfully, it requires some digging deep, like we talked last session. It requires coming out of some maybe simplistic or binary thinking. And so a lot of those thinking tools that you've elucidated in some of your faith crisis work, I think apply here.
They definitely do. And we sometimes talk in my line of work about unknowns. Okay, if I'm going to build something, if I'm going to, write a software program or something, I have some unknowns. I don't really know how it's going to go because of this and that factor. And then there are things that we call like unknown unknowns, where I don't even know what my unknowns are, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where a lot of people find themselves when they begin interacting with a sexual minority, a loved one or someone who is struggling. And so
we're going to help.
Yeah. Hopefully we can help clarify these things.
Yeah.
But we also need to understand that for some of these people, it's almost like they're caught up in this tornado, and they become so emotionally invested in this ally role that it actually gives their life meaning, and it becomes their identity, more so than even their membership in the church, for example, their covenants. So
remember the must be seen as boxes we talked about. This gives you a great opportunity to be seen as a savior almost.
Yep.
You're going to protect all these poor, oppressed people. And the bummer of it is that's kind of true in a lot of cases. They are misunderstood. They are oppressed. But then that takes over in ways that we're going to go deeper in here.
Yep.
And there's not a better place to start than my old friend, G.K. Chesterton, who died before I was born, but he's just someone I love. I came to learn about him through C.S. Lewis and Neil A. Maxwell. And this is from his book, Orthodoxy. And he wrote this 110 years ago, and yet it is so timely. The modern world is not evil. In some ways, the modern world is far too good. It is full of wild and wasted virtues. Think about that, wild and wasted. G.K. Chesterton knew how to turn a phrase, and he never wasted it. When a religious scheme is shattered, so what he means by that is any kind of orthodoxy, any kind of previous social, moral order is shattered. It is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose, and they wander and do damage. But the virtues, what?
Okay. I want to pause here for a second.
Mm-hmm.
When a religious scheme is shattered. So Chesterton here might be talking about a faith tradition, like, Lutheranism or whatever.
It loses its cultural dominance.
Right. But in this situation, we also could be talking about your personal religious paradigm.
Yes.
If your personal religious paradigm has been shattered by the experience of having a loved one come out and, express that they are living that experience of a sexual minority. For some people, that really does shatter their religious paradigm. And it's like, how do I trust church leaders anymore? They don't have all the answers for me that I need right now. And so when a religious scheme is shattered, again, that might be what happens to you.
Yeah.
When a loved one comes out.
And even if it doesn't happen to you, it can happen to the culture, as is happening now and was happening when Chesterton wrote this.
Correct.
So it makes sense that there might be less, because there's the loss of moral authority. It makes sense, as Chesterton says, that people won't be as adherent to a moral system, whether that's out of wedlock childbirth or more crime or those things. This is why Chesterton is Chesterton, because he recognized it isn't just vice that runs amok. The virtues are let loose also, and the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. I think he means even than the vices do. And the modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless, even though truth is a good virtue, right? And some humanitarians, or dare I say allies, only care for pity. We call it compassion or empathy now, but put those words in, and this makes entirely too much sense. And their pity or compassion, empathy, I am sorry to say, is often untruthful.
Right.
So Neil A. Maxwell built on this, and he said there is an ecology that pertains to spiritual things, to human nature, which, when violated, brings a series of consequences, just as inexorable and just as automatic as the ecology that is born of a cluster of laws governing nature. The gospel of Jesus Christ is a collection of principles woven together in the fabric of immutable law. This is the romance and high adventure of orthodoxy. Dan, you and I use orthodoxy in that way, but most people think of orthodoxy as boring. But here he says it's romantic and even adventurous, and I thoroughly agree.
Yep.
These principles, bound together, not only give us salvation, but they also give us balance, depth, and happiness in our lives. The doctrines of Jesus Christ are so powerful that any one of these doctrines, having been broken away from the rest, goes wild and mad, as G.K. Chesterton observed, and as we just read. The principle of love without the principles of justice and discipline goes wild. Any doctrine, unless it is woven into the fabric of orthodoxy, goes wild. The doctrines of the kingdom need each other just as the people of the kingdom need each other.
Wow.
Yeah. Thank you, Brother Chesterton, and thank you, Elder Maxwell. So we talked about the drama triangle before.
We've talked about it several times.
Yes. And we're going to talk about it again because it's important. But this time I'm going to juxtapose some new titles in here. This is how we can get sucked in. And gosh, where do you want to be on this chart? If you're not a sexual minority, you sure don't want to be an enemy. So I guess you have to be an ally. It's really, as we talked about before, rescuer is the fun part of this. Actually, they're all fun because it's drama, and drama is exciting.
Yep.
Even when it's unpleasant and we're all upset, it makes you feel alive. It gives you something to think about and do, and helps you feel like you are important and have a role. So be aware. You can go back and see the other discussion, but don't let yourself get sucked in. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is not get sucked into this triangle. And that, however, I'm going to warn you, that means you probably will be cast as an enemy. And so sometimes in order to do the right thing, you might get called an enemy. I'm not saying needlessly provoke people. Don't be a jerk just for being a jerk. That's easy to get sucked in. That's where you get sucked into being an enemy. We talked about that last time. So we'll just refer you back to that discussion. Now, we're going to sound like a bunch of John Birch Society cranks, but you need to understand some cultural and intellectual history because, believe it or not, it applies to some of the messaging that is heard unwittingly. We need to emphasize this is unwitting. This isn't like we've got a bunch of crypto commies, anybody with a pride flag pin on their lapel. We're not saying they're all a bunch of crypto commies, and we're not a bunch of Joseph McCarthyites. But the cultural currents that were started by Marxism are still here, unwittingly spouted and propagated by the Ally movement. So jump in here, Dan.
Right. When we talk about Marxism, the reason why we're bringing it up here is in a lot of ally spaces and a lot of ally discussions, you are going to see Marxist assumptions emerge. Part of the reason for that is in academic discussions of queer theory and and gender studies and so forth, you do have a lot of very overtly Marxist thinking.
And we don't need to go into it here. Maybe we put some links to it, but you know, the controversy over whether COVID leaked from a lab.
Right.
This did leak from the lab of the Academy of the University's queer theory and its antecedents in Marxism.
Yep. And so when we understand just some basic notions of Marxist assumptions about how the world works, you can see how they come forward in a lot of ally messaging. And so we do need to just kind of go over this very briefly. So Karl Marx, he said that the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. In other words, they hated the idea that anybody would hold something that another person could not hold. Somebody would have something that another person could not have. They hated this. And when we talk about
there is truth in that, but
right,
but we just follow where this goes, though.
Yes. And so when Marx expressed this in economic terms, he was talking about capital as private property. And he basically articulated that there is a base in society, which is how we all live and work. And that contains the means of production, you know, your companies, factories, institutions, and your relationships of production, you know, how like the manager versus worker and those kinds of relationships. And the base, the way we all live, is characterized by systems of oppression and alienation.
That's how it's maintained. That's how this is perpetuated.
Right.
But though it's inherently unjust, as you can see in this theory.
Correct. Now, how are the systems of oppression maintained? Well, there's this thing that we call a superstructure. And this is our culture, our politics, our religion, our art, families, entertainment. All of these things in Marxist theory, they reinforce this ideology that's called capitalism. And capitalism sustains and reinforces the base, and the base reinforces the superstructure. And you just have kind of this cycle of self-reinforcing oppression. This is how Marx viewed all of economics. And he basically painted this as the source of our suffering. And
the main victims are the workers or the proletariat. Right. And then you have the petite bourgeoisie that are sort of the bribed parts. And then anyway, the other parts benefit from the system, but the vast majority of the proletariat, and they're oppressed by this.
Correct. Now, if you take this basic model, this kind of template of, hey, this is how the world works, these assumptions about how the world works, and you apply them to other areas of life. There were academics and, you know, thinkers and activists who followed Marx, who then took these and...
Well, they got disillusioned because the workers of the world were not uniting.
Right.
And so they said, this isn't going to be an economic revolution. We need to go deeper and further.
Yep. And we need to go into culture. And so they looked at race and said, hey, race is actually a property. And the ideology that supports racial disparities is called white supremacy, right? And then we have sexuality as a property. Well, and the ideology that keeps some people being able to express themselves sexually and others not is called heteronormativity, right? And then you have other examples like health as a property, which now they're talking about healthism. And there's a whole set of vocabulary that attends these kinds of discussions about how each of these things is part of a system of oppression. Okay. So we have systems of oppression: marginalized, centering, intersectional, systemic, power, and equity. When you hear these kinds of terms, they are just part of this new Marxist discourse.
It's called
And
neo because it's no longer confined to the economic,
correct.
like Marx himself was preoccupied with. Yeah.
Correct. So if you ever spend some time in spaces that are allyship oriented, you are going to see these assumptions and this vocabulary come into play.
Yeah.
And it's Marxist thinking at work. It's a set of Marxist assumptions about the world. Now, Christianity has a different story, and we could kind of map that out and say, you know, there are differences and life experiences that are products of fallenness, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes sin. And the answer is redemption through Christ,
Mhm.
right? Not the
And building
awakening
a
of
sacred community. Mhm.
right. The sacred community, Zion, and the community of believers. Whereas Marxism, the solution is activism. It's awakening people's critical consciousness and giving them this new vocabulary, and then they spread that forward.
So why people need to understand this, potential allies. We covered some of this in part one when we talked about the word queer, which comes out of its resurrection as a political term and as an identity, as opposed to a slur like it was when I was a kid, is born out of this.
Correct.
And so, and it sounds nice on one level, right? We want to free these people. We want to free the captives, is how we'd put it in Christian terms, right? Isaiah, leading people out of captivity. But in fact, you read deep in the literature and it is not. They want people discontented to be revolutionaries. These systems of oppression need to be overthrown, not merely reformed.
Right.
It is still a revolutionary idea. Again, I'm not saying everybody who uses these terms,
right,
or if everybody who identifies themselves as allies even understands, let alone wants this to happen.
Right.
But the originators of this term are, and whether they're aware of it or not, it is achieving its purpose, which is division, discontent, polarization, poor mental health. What am I leaving out, Dan?
Well, and the creation of an enemy class of people, oppressors.
Yeah.
And so if you are operating in this paradigm, who are the oppressors going to be? Who are, maintaining this superstructure? Well, it's the church. It's your church leaders. It's General Conference is part of this superstructure that oppresses and
it will need enemies. If those were gone, there would be others.
Right.
It's so interesting how parochial some people see, right? I'm speaking here from Utah, and Dan, you're speaking from Virginia, Southern Virginia. There is so much, we're coming up on General Conference. There is so much, there can often be angst and controversy over what President Oaks says, for example, in our Latter-day Saint world. You go to the Deep South, you go to India, you can go to so many places where nobody could even say who he was, right? Nobody knows who he is. We've got this tiny corner of Utah, which is a tiny state in a massive country, and we know who he is, and that's who's been appointed an oppressor. But if you're in other areas, you'll find other oppressors, who also are made out to be seen as omnipotent, as all-powerful. That's part of this polarization that goes on in Marxism.
Correct.
So it's interesting to think about whenever you see the big bad meanie, and then you really think about it, get out of your parochial backwater. It's interesting how transparent some of this rhetoric becomes, how obvious what's going on becomes.
Yep.
So what's the antidote? Well, let's get back to gospel principles. And here I have two talks, which we're not going to go through here, but I highly, highly, highly recommend both of these. There's a Deseret News article from our friend Ty Mansfield, Balancing Tensions of Our Latter-day Saint and LGBTQ Conversations, and Jared Halverson, who talks about love and law at our 2022 North Star Conference. And the entire talk is, again, this Chesterton and Maxwellian ideas of uniting the virtues. And as they're united, they can bless us and those we attempt to serve. But if we let them go wild, they won't. So these are excellent resources. Pause the video and read this and watch this.
Right.
And come back to here. So here's something you'll hear. We shouldn't judge. And as I say, that is true. But sometimes this counsel that we throw out causes us to turn our brains off. And then what we hear is, I must accept everything this person is telling me because I don't want to judge. But in fact, that is also judging. You're judging you're saying, oh, everything this person is saying to me must be true because I can't oppose it.
That's judgment.
That's right. And that too is a judgment. So the way to understand this, and Elder Oaks has a talk on, President Oaks, when he was Elder Oaks, had a talk on this, judgment, ultimate judgments. We definitely should not be judging individuals, their spiritual status, their level of righteousness. Those things, I absolutely 100% agree. But that can turn our brains off if we're like, oh, I'm not going to judge. Not going to judge. I'm just going to take everything these people tell me as the truth. We've talked last time about delusion and other of those poisons that we can get sucked into. And we can take on what this can be a delusion we can take on. I'm not supposed to judge, so I cannot think critically or carefully or thoughtfully about what any sexual or gender minority is telling me, because I have to be loving. And Jesus said I have to love, and Jesus said I can't judge. This is, again, an example of virtue that can go wild. We, in fact, are not commanded not to judge. We are, in fact, commanded to judge righteously. And we are warned to not judge incorrectly, which, if we uncritically assume everything we're told, we are judging unrighteously. I would humbly submit to you. And here's some scriptures, if you'd like to read them more. This is Mormon in the Moroni chapter 7, and I won't read this for you. You can pause it and read it all. But here is a great heuristic. Is this leading people to God? Is it leading them to truth? Is it producing healthy fruit? If it is not, you can judge for yourself, and you can judge what you are going to take into your brain and into your heart. You must do that, or you are going to get in trouble that Mormon warns about here. So that's all I want to say about judging. Now let's talk about a larger dynamic about shifting understanding of the word homosexual. A lot of misunderstanding about this word comes in. And unfortunately, it's not politically incorrect anymore. We'll say same-sex attraction. We'll say gay identity. We'll say different words here. But homosexual is a word that homosexuality is now sort of deprecated. We could have a whole thing about Marxism's ability to chew up and spit out words that are no longer any good. That continually happens, that old words that were perfectly fine and inoffensive are now the worst thing. We don't have to go into that dynamic. I understand homosexual is disfavored now, but you'll see it used in old contexts, in old writings, and in church writings. And the shifting understanding of this word explains much of the disconnect and much of where this the church hates gay people comes from. You've heard that narrative. The church hates gay people. And it comes, the honest parts of that, as opposed to the caricature, the advocacy that can also tend to lie about these things. But there is a root of truth in it, and it is this. The ancient understanding of this word is homosexuality was something you do. So if it talked about homosexuals, it was talking about people who committed same-sex sexual acts. And so if anybody said, oh, that's an abomination, that's a sin, that's a terrible sin, whatever they say, that's what is meant. It is meant to condemn the behavior. And insofar as that was applied to individuals, it was done in an exhortation to encourage the people engaging in those activities to stop doing it. So here's our problem. So while this understanding of homosexual is there, there's a new thing that is coming about, and it happened gradually over the last 180 years or so. But it really took root in the cultural circles that intersected with Orthodox faith, starting in the 70s, 80s, and majorly in the 90s. Both the terms were used both of these ways in the 90s. Now the church does not use this language anymore. But the modern understanding that's gradually come about is homosexuality is something you feel, not what you do, something you feel. And I should add, something you are, right? If you go back to part one and the essentialist idea, it's not just something you feel, it's something you are at your core. As much as your gender is, this is something you are. All right, so now what happens when we hear that homosexuality is an abomination? Someone who's adopted that feeling is going to feel rejected. They're going to feel shame. They're going to feel bad, whether they've done anything or not. And that is absolutely not what the Bible means, any of the prophets in the Bible, or modern church leaders mean when they use words like sin, abomination. They did not have that understanding of that. And I don't know that they should. If you've gone into my thinking on this, I don't think our modern definition is actually better. I think in a lot of ways it's worse. But that's neither here nor there for our purposes here. The purpose is we have to be aware of this disconnect, that we are talking past each other. We've been talking past each other for 30, 40 years. When we talk about something, is this just something you do? That's the way this side is saying. And then the person hearing over here is hearing, this is who you are. This is who you are, not what you do. Anyway, it's led to no end of pain, and it's very sad. I'm not sure it's the church's fault because they're not the ones that changed here, but they've understood, and now they do not use this language out of sensitivity to that. But you can see some other things. So a lot of the so-called homophobic statements that church leaders made, when you understand it in this context of something people are doing that church leaders are encouraging them to not do anymore, a lot of the so-called homophobia goes away. Now, remember heteronormativity, the neo-Marxists are still going to call it homophobic because anything heteronormative is homophobic by definition. But actual homophobic, right? Gay bashing, hatred and cruelty to gay people, it can seem that way when we bring this understanding there.
Right.
Similarly, when church leaders talked about, well, this can change. A lot of us now can read that as saying, oh, they're talking conversion therapy. They're talking all this discredited research that's not possible. But in fact, when church leaders talk about change, and you can read Greg Smith's paper here that we linked to, he goes through every single incidence of this that he could find. They're talking about changing behavior. They're talking about you don't have to do homosexual things anymore. They were not saying, in fact, many times they go on to say, but they're clipped out of some of the advocates and some of these activists, allies, quotes. They clip the parts out that say, yes, you may still be tempted. You may still have the feelings, but your actions you can control. But they'll cut those parts out sometimes. And then again, modern readers will read these things and get outraged and hurt. Again, this is a symptom of how advocates and allies in this Marxist idea create pain. They're not actually helping anybody by doing this, by distorting church leaders, by refusing to give context to what they mean. Who is really doing the hurting here? Is it the church leaders or the advocates who are snipping and clipping and combining these quotes in ways that hurt sexual minorities and then lead them to believe what? The church hates me. I think it's a tragedy, and you can tell how I feel about it. All in some sort of way to, I guess, manipulate the church into changing their position and joining the revolutionary cause.
Yeah, you might call it emotional extortion in a sense, and manipulation.
It's almost emotional hijacking or kidnapping, because they're upsetting these people to bring them to their side. So there's another interesting wrinkle to this too, though. And you'll see that some people say, well, the church has changed so much. The church used to say having the feelings was bad, and now they don't anymore. So if they've come from here, even having feelings is bad, the feelings aren't bad, just the behavior is to, well, why can't they change this much? But actually, the way the church has talked about it has changed a lot in response to, because the world has changed and how they think of it. And I like the way we talk about it much better too. So I'm not advocating we go back to the old way. I love the way church leaders talk about this today. But not as much changed as the advocates are suggesting has, which then leads people to this other narrative that's being created, which is the church is moving more towards accepting same-sex behavior. And then anytime a church leader says something against that, people get outraged, people get hurt, because they're like, well, wait, I thought there were, and that's again a Marxist Hegelian idea that there's only one way history moves. And history is only moving that way. It's moving this way. And so they create the false idea that there's been more change than there has. And then that gives this false hope. So that's another way that this changing way we talk about, this changing understanding is played into it.
And sometimes we talk about the fallacy of composition. And the fallacy of composition is where you say, if something is true of one thing, then it's true of all of those things. And so you say, okay, this or that church teaching has evolved over time. Well, then every church teaching can evolve. Every church teaching can change in whatever way I imagine it should, right? And they refuse to make distinctions between things that are firmly settled, repeated by all of church leadership for decades, right? Versus things that are more ephemeral, more, policy oriented, that can change. So that's another factor at play here.
Yeah. Okay. Now, next, let's talk about labels, because we talk about labels. I just had somebody again the other day ask me, well, what's LGBTQIAAP2S? Anyway, those are the labels. Let's talk about, in this standpoint, why that is important to some. And my buddy, Mark Yarhouse here, who I so admire, he's not a member of our church, but he is a Christian who is faithful to the traditional understanding around sexuality, family, and gender. And this whole talk is great. You can watch it here, but we're going to jump in at the 30-minute mark here and just listen for a minute.
And so sometimes when they do come out, they can come out with such act of certainty. It's almost resilience to tell people this is who I am if I'm going to risk telling you about this. And then sort of we react to that, and it kind of spirals from there. Would it be more helpful if they just described what they felt and kind of brought you in? Sure, but they're a teenager and they're doing this as best they can. And so ours is the role of being the adult in the room and saying, okay, let's see how we can be a resource to you, even if they're not asking right now to be a resource. But how can I love you well as you navigate these questions? Because I understand, you're not saying this to the teenager, but you're understanding how compelling that vision of identity and community would be. And it gives you a place to pray into their life and to recognize this is going to be challenging to navigate.
Okay, we will pause there. He's talking specifically about teenagers there, but it really applies to anyone who's newly coming to acknowledge this about themselves. And so again, I'm just kind of recapitulating what Mark Yarhouse says here, Dr. Yarhouse. And so when someone says, especially early on, I'm gay, for example, or any of those other labels, this is often a time when they're coming to grips with some of these aspects of themselves. And so that means when they say that, it's often as a result of them reducing or eliminating shame. They're not feeling as isolated and alone. They're not feeling as burdened. They're not feeling as many negative emotions like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation is as big a deal in their lives. So we have to be really careful if we're going to push back on the label, say, don't call yourself gay. President Nelson said, don't adopt that identity. Problem is, what they will hear is, go back in the closet, go back to that shame, go back to that misery, go back to that self-hatred, depression, and pretending to be something you're not. Well, who's going to want to do that, right? Nobody wants to do that. And that's why people will fight you tooth and nail, because that's what they hear when we might push back or be critical about these labels.
Now, Jeff, you would not do that. You would not do that because you have spent so much time thinking through, what do people mean when they say this? And how do I process this? And how do I view identity? And what are the other ways that people view identity? What are the consequences of like, you've done so much work to understand all of those things. And that's why we said early in this presentation, when you talk to somebody who is wanting to be an ally, they may have done none of the work of understanding those things. And so they might hear in a statement from President Nelson about, identity labels, they might hear exactly that.
More proof the church hates gay people and doesn't understand them.
Right. Just kind of that gut reaction, and then reinforce that among whoever they are trying to help.
Yeah.
Right. And just reinforce just kind of a damaging interpretation because they haven't done that work. And it doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just, they have not had the tool set. They haven't learned to apply themselves to really think through things.
And I will say, I have said those words. I have said, don't call yourself gay. So I've reformed, hopefully. Some people would say I've got some more to do, and that's certainly true. But I did used to do this, so I learned some of this the hard way with hurting some people. So, but I do have to put my cards on the table and say, even though, yes, this represents liberation and freedom, and no wonder you want to have a parade or march in a parade and celebrate this new liberation that you feel. No wonder that happens. Nevertheless, so as a developmental stage, it can be important and necessary, perhaps even to many, or at least some, that they are coming out of shame and getting support for this. So in that sense, adopting the gay label can be a really good thing. Though long-term, I still believe and maintain that if that label is strongly held to and over a long-term period, it will interfere with our discipleship. It will limit our ability to feel like we can belong to the body of Christ in a full way. So one of the questions you can ask is, you don't want to sound too defensive in doing this, but in a curious way with someone you already have trust with, what does that label give you? And I was talking to someone who said, well, why don't you identify as lesbian or gay? This was a woman. And she's like, at the point where I am in my life, it doesn't offer me anything that I don't already have, that I want. And I thought that was so insightful. I've stolen it from her. It's my friend Shannon Rance. But I do believe it's possible to have all the benefits of coming out process, which coming out has, if it wasn't originally, it's certainly become part of this neo-Marxist process. Now, maybe we should talk about that sometime, Dan, but that coming out process has been politicized and weaponized in ways, but in the old school way that's determined, right? Admitting to yourself and others that you have some feelings that might not be normative and that you're feeling shame and isolation about. In that sense, you do need those benefits. And you can do that without adopting some of the negative and limiting worldly associations of the gay identity. Because even if you don't accept all of those as a gay person, as a gay identified person, I believe, again, this is just my belief, but it is based on 30 years of observation and personal experience. I believe that term, despite how I want to define it, right? How the individual says it means this to me and it does not mean these other things that it means to many, many other people. I still believe that that collective conception of being gay can exert a gravitational pull on the person. So the key one is, if the saying is, somebody said to me once, if you're gay, you should be gay. And it sounds like a tautology, but it's an insightful one, because think about what it means. If you're gay and you're not gay, it means you're not having same-sex relationships. You're not seeking or engaging in same-sex relationships. And therefore, you're not fully gay. And if you're not fully gay, you're incomplete. And you might feel incomplete. So if you can feel complete living the gospel, feel like you belong, and you're contributing to the church with the gay label, good for you. Just be aware that some people are going to have this pull, that there is this gravitational pull that I think if you're aware of it, you can navigate it just fine. So I'm not saying you can't ever use this label, but I do think you should be aware that for many people, almost all the people in the world, and even a lot of people in the church, when you say, I am gay, it means you're not just gay, but you're being gay in this funny sense of the word. And so there can be confusion on both sides, because then I know people that use the term gay because they're like, nobody knows what same-sex attraction is, and still less know what the heck a sexual minority is. Hopefully, if they've watched our stuff, they will. So I get that, and I understand the complexities there. And so I'm not trying to be the language police here. But whether you identify as gay or not, those of us ministering to those people need to be the kind of people that those sexual minorities can talk to and get support from. We can help them eliminate that shame, isolation, anxiety, self-hatred, and recognize that the person that you're talking to, that sexual minority who's identifying as whatever label it is, they need your help with that. They need help with feeling different. The fancy word is minority stress. They've been feeling different. They need help feeling like they belong. They need help seeing those aspects of themselves that they do share with other people, even as there are. We don't want to deny or ignore those parts that aren't. It's an additive process. Sometimes people say, oh, that's just like, and we'll talk about some of these examples later, but there's a lot of single people in the church and they all have their challenges. We all have our challenges. That is actually true. But when the sexual minority hears that, what they hear is, your unique experience is not important to me. I am not seeing you. And I don't want to see you as you. I want to see you as everybody else. And you can see, especially, and that's not good for anybody to feel, but especially if you're a sexual minority and you felt different, you felt like you had to pretend for all this time, that's really going to help you feel different. That's really going to make you feel isolated more. So people need to feel like, as much as we can help these sexual minorities feel like we see them and understand them in their unique way, and then help them see the ways their experiences can relate to other people's. And that's going to be a unique process, and it's going to be a unique way of learning, because everybody is unique. That is true. But the only way we can be a body of saints is if we transcend those differences and come together on those parts of us that are important, which is why President Nelson gave us the counsel about child of the covenant, child of God, disciple of Christ. That's why those labels are so important, because if we let the other ones dominate, we see churches rip apart a Republican versus Democrat, masks versus no masks, vaccines versus no vaccines, or race in some parts of the world. We see our church because in all those cases, I would humbly suggest we've forgotten our primary identity, which isn't pro-vax, anti-vax, or whatever it is. But the same thing happens here. We have to help that person feel seen and known, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But that's some of the problem with some of that language when we push back on, or we diminish or dismiss people's experience. Okay, now we're going to get into a little complicated thing too, but it's so important. Once you see this, and if you can grasp this, my friends that are watching, my brothers and sisters, you will not ever unsee this. You will see this happening over and over again. And it's called the double H effect.
I guess we should maybe set the stage and say,
Yes.
as you encounter ally messaging or just messaging in general around sexual minorities, people might invoke research studies, right? Oh, there's research that says this. There are studies that say this. And you have to understand that there's a lot going on when we talk about a study or research in general, right? And there are things we kind of make some assumptions that when somebody claims, oh, there's research that shows this, that what they did was they just sat down and did an examination of some phenomenon and did surveys or some kind of analysis, and they were looking objectively at whatever they were studying. And the product of that was, here are some objective observations of reality. And there you go. That's your output, right? That's kind of what we assume, but there's a lot more to consider here.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of you may be familiar with the term reification, which is half of it, which is taking an abstract idea and turning it into something real. I would suggest the concept of sexual orientation might be one of those things. And I don't just mean homosexuality or same-sex attraction. I mean, heterosexuality even might be a reification. I'll just give you the definition of reify first. Is to consider or represent something abstract as a material or concrete thing, to give definite content and form to a concept or idea. And so we'll see an example in the next section. We're going to talk about maps versus the territory. And that's a great example of a reification. Those lines on a map are reified. So the reification, what Jason Blakely is saying here is that reified initial idea then turns around and creates and contributes to the phenomenon. So here, efforts at descriptive scientific theory, and I would add political and cultural phenomena do this too, when applied to human beings, can actually produce new identities, practices, and worlds of meaning. Can I hear that again? We can actually create something here that is new.
You're trying to describe, and you end up not describing, creating.
We are going to measure X. And in the process of talking about X, we create X, and therefore we measure it. Oh, now it's real. This is due to humans' uniquely creative meaning-making capacities and is what philosophers refer to as the double hermeneutic effect, in which an interpretation of the world shapes the very interpretations that comprise it. The interpretation then shapes and creates the interpretations that comprise it. Viewed from the perspective of the double H effect, much of social science is not simply descriptive, but also performative. Social science is not a neutral effort at description, but enacts and inaugurates, creates certain realities. Social science theories are often slippery, and what often presents itself as a social science is instead culture and power.
Now, we mentioned earlier Marxism.
They understand this very well.
Yeah. Marxists in the academy, in universities, they do not view their research as simply observing and describing reality. It is all activism. It's intended to create things and shape things in certain ways.
And it works.
Yep.
So let's look at some examples of double H effect in action. Religiously devout LGBT individuals are at high risk of suicide. So then we talk to people and we say, oh my gosh, are you going to kill yourself? I hope you don't kill yourself. Do you have anything? Here's the hotline. Well, and sometimes we need to do that, but this is where it's a two-edged sword. And this is actually larger than the sexual minority thing. I could put a chart up showing it's when the federal government decided to reduce suicides in the Clinton administration that suicide rates exploded. So you have to wonder if what we're doing is working. The queer example from part one, where my friend's daughter came out as polyromantic asexual, That's another example. She's really just a boy crazy girl, but she got queered and decided she was this label and this different thing. We talked, the church hates gay people. That becomes a double H effect, because then there's more anger, and then it's easy to get sucked into that drama triangle when there's a lot of anger and betrayal. The idea, as I suggested earlier, that sexual orientation exists as a thing, an actual thing that exists. Like, maybe we can't see it, but we know it's there, like your spleen, right? How could you even find your spleen? But we know you've got one. Is it like that? Or is it a concept like Democrat and Republican, which if you go back 80 years, a lot of the platforms were flipped. So that's not a thing. It may explain, as we talked about in part one, why most, if not all of the reason why life satisfaction and mental health of LGBT plus individuals is declining dramatically, even as rights, privileges, awareness, and acceptance have all expanded dramatically. Things seem to be getting worse for the mental health of sexual minorities and gender minorities, even as all of this is progressing, supposedly. The best way to explain that is the double H effect, I think. Now, here's an example. A colleague, I'm a part-time therapist, as I've mentioned before, and one of my colleagues told me that his daughter came out as bisexual, which, as an interesting aside, I'm noticing in my work is actually causing more distress among young people than bi or poly or pan than is being gay. I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon that I have more clients worried about if they might be bi than if they might be gay. But anyway, this colleague's daughter came out. She was 14. She sits her parents down and she says, "I'm bisexual." She was sure that her parents were going to kick her out of the house when she told them this. Now, as parents, we say things, sometimes we forget, we don't remember, but this friend and colleague of mine has worked in this area for longer than his daughter has been born. And he is a wonderful, loving, kind person. I can 99.9% guarantee he never said anything insensitive about sexual minorities. So who told her that her parents would kick her out? Her parents never did. Dan, who told her parents would kick her out?
Probably her social circles or allies, social media comments, probably, a combination of those factors.
She probably couldn't even tell you where she got that idea. Right. But I think it's the double H effect in action. I mean, fortunately, the parents convinced her, and now I'm not even sure she identifies as bi anymore, but we probably should talk about the instability of sexual orientation in young people a bit. But she wasn't kicked out, so it wasn't a full example of the double H effect. But you could imagine her running away, right? She's so distressed. She gets online, decides she's bi, and that her parents are going to kick her out, and she runs away. And therefore, she's added to this phenomenon. She might even tell people at the Youth Resource Center, "Oh, I can't be at home because my parents won't accept me." So this creates a problem. And then that person at the clinic goes, "Oh my gosh," and they write a news article. They tell their colleagues, "Oh my gosh, there's these active Latter-day Saint parents kicking their children out," which I'm sure happens. And that is a tragedy. And anybody listening to this who's done that, repent and stop. However, all the examples I have heard of that I've been able to drill in the details of that, I do not personally know of a case of this. I know of cases where children are identifying as a sexual minority and engaging in behaviors that are endangering the household and the other kids in the household. And therefore, they cannot be in the house anymore. It is not because they came out as gay or whatever. It is because of the dangerous behaviors they are engaging in. Again, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I am saying the cases I know, it is more that problem. It has always been, in my personal experience, that problem. But then those examples may be turned into, oh, my parents kicked me out because I was gay. No, my parents kicked me out because I was introducing my younger siblings to porn or drugs or, those sorts of things. Those are the examples I'm personally familiar with. But that all this double H effect creates this narrative. And now some kids are scared to come out because they think they're going to get thrown out of the house. Here's an interesting example we found in a magazine Dan and I both like called The New Atlantis.
Yep. Do you want me to read this one?
Sure.
Okay. So it says a 2014 New York Times Magazine piece titled "The Scientific Quest to Prove Bisexuality Exists" provides an illustration of the themes explored in this part: sexual desire, attraction, orientation, and identity, and of the difficulties with defining and studying these concepts. Specifically, the article shows how a scientific approach to studying human sexuality can conflict with culturally prevalent views of sexual orientation, or with the self-understanding that many people have of their own sexual desires and identities. Such conflicts raise important questions about whether sexual orientation and related concepts are as coherent and well-defined as is often assumed by researchers and the public alike. The author of the article, Benoit Denizet-Lewis, an openly gay man, describes the work of scientists and others trying to demonstrate the existence of a stable bisexual orientation. He visited researchers at Cornell University and participated in tests used to measure sexual arousal, tests that include observing the way pupils dilate in response to sexually explicit imagery. To his surprise, he found that, according to this scientific measure, he was aroused when watching pornographic films of women. Now, here's what he said. Might I actually be bisexual? Have I been so wedded to my gay identity, one I adopted in college and announced with great fanfare to family and friends, that I haven't allowed myself to experience another part of myself? In some ways, even asking those questions is anathema to many gays and lesbians. That kind of publicly shared uncertainty is catnip to the Christian right and to the scientifically dubious, psychologically damaging ex-gay movement it helped spawn. As out gay men and lesbians, after all, we're supposed to be sure. We're supposed to be, quote unquote, born this way. Despite the apparently scientific, though admittedly limited, evidence of his bisexual typical patterns of arousal, Denizet-Lewis rejected the idea that he was actually bisexual because, quote, it doesn't feel true as a sexual orientation, nor does it feel right as my identity, end quote. So what happens is this man goes and becomes a research subject. And in response to some data that emerge in this research showing that he is capable of being aroused by women, he then engages in a process of interrogating, his identity, and he actually reinforces his gay identity in response. It wasn't, okay, I'm going to arrive at this dispassionate view of myself. No, he actively made decisions in response to this.
I can't be bi because I have this thing called gay.
Yes.
And it's real and it exists, so I'm going to ignore.
Right. So as participating as a research subject, this process reified his gay identity, right? This is the double H effect at work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It has become a thing and it exerts real and in real ways. It's not just in Denizet-Lewis's mind here. It's become real. It's not like he's pretending any of this. This is the power. We're not saying all these people are dumb. We're trying to say this is really powerful.
Yep.
An example I'll sometimes use in the past that seems really weird to us now is 100 years ago, women used to faint all the time. I don't think anybody told women to faint. Oh, you're having some emotionally difficult thing, you should faint. Something in the culture told women that if there's an emotional problem, that's your way to respond to it. Women don't faint anymore. So these things do change. I mean, we all faint, but they don't faint the way they seem to have in the past, even though I don't think they've fundamentally changed. But something in our culture, in this case, it's a good way, has changed so that women get the idea they can handle emotionally difficult things without passing out. Here's some examples of things that can be double H effects in effect or creating problems around us. People are getting kicked out of BYU just based on who they love. Just think about that for a minute. Are you kicked out of BYU for loving someone too much? I have friends in the administration, and I've asked them, and they say no.
Right.
In fact, they bend over backwards to keep people at BYU, and they encourage people to love deeply and fully. What might cause some issues with continuing ecclesiastical endorsement is continuing to have same-sex behavior that is contrary to God's design.
But even without the behavior, if you're a sexual minority at BYU and somebody says this, and let's say they even take a case that they know of that has been, exaggerated or misrepresented, right? But they tell you this and you internalize it. I'm in a hateful place. I'm in a place that hates me. And they hate me because of who I love. Then, you might even transfer out and say, yeah, I'm part of this. I wasn't technically kicked out, but they made it unbearable for me to be there, right?
And if you don't leave, you're going to be very unhappy.
Right.
So the tragedy is we should be acting on those feelings of love. I'm not talking about romantic infatuation or lust here, which is often conflated.
Right.
But we should be loving everybody. That's what Jesus said. And M. Scott Peck told us, as we talked previously, love is most of all an action and a practice. It's a spiritual practice beyond a feeling. And from that understanding, BYU needs lots more love. It needs lots more love from and towards sexual minorities. And it's so limiting to teach people that they can't love. Even if the people saying that or think they're doing good, right? They're trying to advocate for these gay people. They're telling them they can't love. And that is a terrible thing to tell somebody. I said it to a client the other day. He was saying, I don't want to act on my same-sex attraction. And I said, why can't you act on it? You should act on it. Those feelings of love you have for your fellow man can be acted upon in many, many righteous ways. There are many, many ways to express love, affection, have deep, emotional, intimate connections with men, and that are totally appropriate, not romantic, not sexual, but are still incredibly fulfilling. So act on those same-sex attraction in the broad sense of attraction. Act on them. He burst into tears. He's like, I never heard of that before. I never thought these feelings could be good, but they can. But this rhetoric contributes just as much as whatever fundamentalists might be saying on the other side, on the shame-pride dichotomy went through in part 3. And of course, we talked already about the church, how the church hates gay people and how that comes. The church welcomes everyone who is striving to follow the standards, no matter how short they might be falling from those standards, no matter how far away from the ideal they are. If they cherish those ideals and seek to meet them, however imperfectly, however haltingly, they are more than welcome. Anybody with that attitude, in fact, is going to enrich the body of Christ, no matter how much they're screwing up. If they just hold this as an ideal and strive, they're not only welcome, but they are a gift and a blessing, no matter how many flaws they have. That's it for part 4.2. Join us next time when we talk about, finally, now we've talked about your internal work. In this group, we've talked about the larger cultural dynamics going on. And next time we're going to talk about, all right, what about the person in front of you? How do you help them? You've got somebody you love and care about, has this issue. What do I do? Stay tuned.